boys and girls, we are going to learn about a new tall tale. Hero today, Paul Bunyan. Before we get started, let's go over some vocabulary words for Paul Bunyan. All right, the first word is admiration. What word? Yes, admiration. All right, the sentence says, Liz had a great deal of admiration for her younger sister, who always tried her best. Admiration is a feeling of respect, or you like it. Right, if you admire someone, you really like them, or you really care for them. Admiration. What word? Yes, admiration. The next word is colossal. What word? Colossal. On Jamal's family trip across the United States, they stopped to drive up Pikes Peak, a colossal mountain in Colorado. All right, it's an adjective. It means unbelievably large or great. All right, so it's not just big. It is enormous. That word is colossal. What word? Yes, colossal. And the next word is frontier. What word? Frontier. We talked about a lot of these tall tales are on the frontier during the settlers' times. All right, Lewis and Clark explored the frontier with a skilled group of woodsmen. The frontier was the unsettled part of the American West. So the part of the United States where people had not settled yet. It was before it was actually part of the United States yet. Unsettled land. Frontier, what word? Frontier. The next word is inseparable. What word? Inseparable. The brothers were inseparable during the summer. That means they're always together, not able to be separated. And I couldn't think of two better people than Mario and Luigi, kind of like peanut butter and jelly. You kind of, if you see one, you see the other. Inseparable, always together. Okay. Now, let's look at our tall tale. Remember, as we read today, you're going to be looking for exaggerations. All right, our tall tale hero today is known as a lumberjack. A lumberjack is a person who cuts wood. All right, that was a common job back then, a logger. There was a lot of unsettled land. That means there was a lot of trees. So guess what they had to do to use the land? They had to cut the trees. So that was a very common job. All right, remember, a lot of things are exaggerated or the truth is stretched. And the way they solve their problems is kind of silly. Okay, it's not a way we would normally solve our problems. If you see an exaggeration, show me a muscle, okay? We're going to talk about all the exaggerations we see as we go along. All right, remember, exaggerations in tall tales make the character seem larger than life. He or she is always bigger, stronger, smarter, and faster than people in real life can ever be. All right, some examples of exaggeration. Maybe they catch a fish this big and the fish is so big that they have to drag it with a freight train home, okay? So they'll have some kind of crazy story to go along with it. It's something that could never, ever happen. So let's see what happens in Paul Bunyan, one of my favorites. So look at that baby. I see some exaggeration already without even reading. Do you? Even as a baby, Paul Bunyan was mighty big. How big? Well, he was so big that his parents had to use a covered wagon as his cradle. I see some exaggeration. How many of you guys ever slept in a covered wagon as your baby bed? I don't think so. As you might imagine, young Paul Bunyan had a big appetite. He gobbled up 5 barrels of porridge each day. And his parents had to milk 4 dozen cows every morning just to keep his bottle filled. I got some more exaggeration coming my way. What about you? Now these are barrels. Alright, it says 4 barrels of porridge. Porridge is like oatmeal. You think that baby could eat 4 big old barrels of oatmeal like that? And then need 4 dozen cow's milk to feed him every day? No. That is definitely exaggeration. Look at how big he is up against his parents. Paul was so big, it caused some problems for the town in Maine, where he grew up. When he sneezed, he blew the birds from Maine to California. When he snored, the neighbors ran out of their houses, hollering, "Earthquake! Earthquake!" Do you think he really blew the birds from Maine all the way to the other side of the United States to California? Sounds like exaggeration to me. Well, after that, Paul's father thought it might be better if Paul didn't sleep in town. Instead, he built a cot on a large raft for Paul, and it floated off the coast. Paul slept on the raft for a few nights, but the floating cot didn't work. When Paul turned over in his sleep, he created gigantic waves that knocked down houses along the coast. Look at him when he turns over. He's tearing the houses down. What does that sound like? Exaggeration. Well, eventually Paul's father decided that the East Coast was just too small for Paul Bunyan. The only sensible thing to do was to move out west. So the Bunyan family moved to Minnesota. In those days, Minnesota was full of logging camps, sawmills, and lumberjacks. Americans were moving out west and building the country. They had to cut down a lot of trees to make their homes, not to mention their schools and churches, boats and furniture. When he grew up, Paul went to work as a lumberjack. And what a lumberjack was he! He made himself a giant axe with a handle carved out of a fully grown hickory tree. So here's the tree he used to make his axe handle. He could bring down a giant tree with one swing of his axe. Now look at it. He just swing one time. Look at all the trees coming up. What does that sound like? Exaggeration. Look at all the men. As the tree tipped over, he would yell, "Timber!" So the lumberjacks had time to get out of the way. Everyone looked up to Paul, way up. The other lumberjacks lumberjacks were full of admiration. That means they really what? They really like Paul. They really are amazed and like Paul. They're really proud of him. The bosses were grateful for the amazing amount of work that Paul could do in a day. Paul had a big heart too. But one thing he always wished for was a true friend. There simply wasn't anybody else his size to be his friend. That all changed during the winter of the Big Blue Snow. It was called the winter of the Big Blue Snow because it was so cold that everything shivered and turned blue. Even the snow shivered and turned blue. Does the snow shiver and turn blue? Oh, that's an exaggeration. One day, as Paul made his way through the blue snowdrifts, he heard a muffled whimper. He followed the noise until he saw two big blue furry things sticking up out of the snow. He reached down and gave it a pull. What do you think it was, guys? If you know Paul Bunyan, you probably know what it is. What is it? Yeah, it's Babe's ears. Look. It turned out that the two big blue furry things were two big blue ears. And connected to the two big blue ears was a giant blue baby ox. Paul exclaimed, "The poor little fella is half frozen." Paul carried the blue ox home, wrapped him in blankets, and fed him. The baby ox was so content that he took a long nap in Paul's big, strong arms. When he woke up, he looked up at Paul. And do you know what he said? "Mama, Mama." Then he gave Paul a big slobbery lick on the face. Paul laughed and said, "Babe, we're going to be great friends." And they were. In fact, Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox were soon inseparable. That means they were never apart. They were always together. Everywhere Paul went, Babe went too. The two of them worked together in the lumber camps. Paul chopped down the trees, then Babe hauled them to the river and dropped them in so they could float downstream to a sawmill. Together, Paul and Babe did the work of 100 men. The lumber company figured the best way to keep Paul Bunyan happy was through his stomach. So they hired a special cook to feed Paul and Babe. Why would the lumberjack company want to keep Paul Bunyan happy? Yeah, you want to keep a guy that big happy because he does a lot of what? Yeah, he does a lot of work. That's right. They want to keep him happy. The cook's name was Sourdough Sam. Sourdough Sam. Sourdough is the type of bread. So they named him after bread. How about that? Sourdough Sam was known for giant flapjacks that he cooked in the world's biggest frying pan. The colossal pan sat on an enormous cast iron frame. Every morning, Sourdough Sam would build a raging forest fire under the pan. Then he would call for his two helpers, Lars Larson and Pete Peterson. So here they are, and here's Sourdough Sam. Lars and Pete would grease up the pan by tying slabs of bacon to their feet and skating back and forth across the sizzling pan. So see, they've got the bacon on their feet, And they're greasing down the pan, skating around on it. Then Sourdough Sam would make a giant stack of pancakes for Paul and an even larger stack for Babe. So who ate more? Babe ate more. Look, he had him a contraption. He would just tilt it over and make his pancakes in there. Thanks to Sourdough Sam and his overgrown flapjacks, Babe eventually grew to be even bigger than Paul. He was so big that if you were standing at his front legs, you would have to use a telescope to see all the way to his back legs. In fact, he was so heavy that his footprints filled up with water and turned into lakes. There are more than 10,000 lakes in Minnesota today. And most of them were created by Babe the Blue Ox back in the frontier days. Alright, so all of those are examples of what? Exaggeration. Can anyone really make giant flapjacks like this? And can Babe really make lakes? No. Alright, let's keep reading. Babe and Paul helped the lumberjacks solve all sorts of problems. Once there was a river that was full of twists and turns. Sometimes the trees would get stuck in the turns and never make it downstream to the sawmill. But Paul Bunyan thought of a way to fix that. He went to one end of the river and sent Paul to the other end. Paul grabbed the river and pulled it in one direction. Babe pulled the other end in the opposite direction. Look at them, they're grabbing the river and pulling on it. Can you grab a river and pull on it? I don't think so. Then, snap! Just like that, all of the kinks were pulled out of the river. And that river was straight as an axe handle. Of course, this tightening operation left the river a good deal longer than it was before. And there was a lot of extra water lying around. Paul and Babe worked together to dig 5 big holes to hold all the extra water. Nowadays, these are called the Great Lakes. Now, did Paul actually create the Great Lakes? No, this is definitely an example of what? Exaggeration. Yes. Now, one day, the logging bosses got to talking. One of them said, the United States was a fine country, to be sure, but it could still stand a little improvement. For one thing, it could use a few more rivers. And what it really needed was a big river running right down the middle of the country, all the way from Minnesota down to New Orleans. If we had a river like that, the man said, we could ship timber down to New Orleans, all the way around the world. Does anyone know a river that's right down the middle of the United States? That goes all the way down? See if your parents know. We'll talk about it tomorrow. See if you can figure out what the name of that river is. We're going to stop there. All right, I'm going to have just a couple of questions to review what we've learned today about Paul. You'll do those just to check. It's not for a grade, just to check your comprehension of what we've read. And then we will finish our story on Paul Bunyan tomorrow.